When Rishi Sunak became the first non-white Prime Minister of Great Britain, the question was posed as to the true meaning of this watershed moment in the nation's history. Benjamin Disraeli is remembered as the country's first Jewish premier, but his ascension to power is not considered the key development in the Jewish community's emergence as Britain's most significant minority. If Sunak's historic achievement changes the assumptions of non-whites in the United Kingdom and encourages some of them to believe that they too could take up positions of prominence, then Sunak's period in office will be remembered as a key signpost in Britain's evolution towards being a modern multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy. Of course, there are black, white, and brown people who have little tolerance for this optimistic attitude to Britain's first premier of Asian heritage. Comforted by their own cynicism or perhaps a nihilistic prejudice, these curmudgeons speculated at the time that Sunak, like his 19th-century predecessor Benjamin Disraeli, would not threaten the survival of the country's caste system of racial supremacy. The PM would be the ship that came and went in the night, leaving Britain still struggling to truly come to terms with its imperial past and the presence of a growing number of non-white citizens. This is a snapshot of the talking points put forward by the likes of Kehind Andrews, just after Sunak had become Prime Minister. "Do not fall for the symbolism of Rishi Sunak's premiership," warned the headline of the Birmingham City University professor's October 26, 2022 CNN blog post. Andrews, who teaches Black Studies in Britain's second city, started with a classic bait-and-switch compositional tactic.
Britain welcomed its first non-white Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, a practicing Hindu, on the first day of the festival Diwali. You could be forgiven for thinking this is a ray of light for British race relations, and it has already been heralded as a historic moment, marking a change from when Sunak was born in 1980 when there were no black or Asian members of Parliament. Unfortunately, rather than a sign of progress, this is a serious case of beware what you wish for.
Andrews is something of a leader in a sometimes admirable but permanently dissatisfied group of leftist Atlantic intellectuals and black nationalists, who from their television appearances and social media streams, appear to see change but still disbelieve their own eyes. Previously, such people denounced President Barack Obama's presidency for its failure to uplift black Americans. They can see no good coming from a Sunak premiership. Of course, they would be right if Obama had been elected on a manifesto written up by his spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright. But Obama came to power on a promise to unite the country and tried to do just that, even as he was vilified as an alien imposter by one Donald J. Trump. It may be that Obama has a thin record on helping directly black people to push back against centuries of white supremacy, but it is undeniable that his very presence in the White House had an electrifying impact on black Americans and a transformative impact on black politics in the country. Let us not forget that a black, or more accurately, a biracial president, had never been thought possible in more than 400 years. Obama might have been all symbolism and optics, but for a people that had endured the serial humiliations of slavery, civil war, and Jim Crow segregation, symbolism and optics carried deep meaning. But Obama's legacy is for another podcast. Let us return to the thoughts of Professor Andrews on Prime Minister Sunak.
We should remember that Sunak was not elected. The other conservative candidate for the top job conceded after failing to meet the threshold of nominations. So this tells us little about voter attitudes in the wider electorate to racialized minority candidates. It is notable that members of Parliament on Monday were so keen to ensure Sunak had no competition because there is no certainty he would have fared any better in a second poll later in the week of the wider, disproportionately white, male and elderly Conservative Party membership. This is the party that was voted in on the back of the xenophobic Little England Brexit campaign, which promised to keep out foreigners and restore Britain to its former colonial glories. This is the party that has brought in the most racist immigration legislation in British history, including the hostile environment that led to the Windrush scandal and the recent plan to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. This is the party that commissioned a report that claimed institutional racism no longer exists. This is the party that has brought in a policing bill that makes the maximum punishment for defacing a statue 10 years, more than some offenders have been sentenced to for rape, according to the Labour Party. Sunak has not directly owned any of these policies, but he has fully supported them. In his failed leadership campaign, he reaffirmed the Rwanda policy and made a concerted effort to boost his anti-woke credentials by condemning those who he said were attempting to bulldoze traditional British values. The fact that his skin is brown and his parents are immigrants does not mean he automatically has any affinity to the millions of black and brown citizens who are victims of his party and its policies. It may be tempting to fall for the symbolism, but Sunak does not represent racialized minorities in Britain. Race relations are far more complicated than simply white and non-white. There are an array of positions, histories, and controversies that mean the only people Sunak can represent are conservative politicians. Unfortunately, the conservatives have learned to play the politics of identity to perfection. Elevating racial minorities to positions of prominence provides the diversity fig leaf to hide the party's racist policies. It cannot be a coincidence that the most racist immigration policy agenda has been delivered by a procession of Asian Home Secretaries. It is almost impossible to imagine a white politician proposing to deport immigrants to Rwanda, but Priti Patel, whose parents were Ugandan Indian, could get away with such draconian measures without being accused of racism.
So, Sunak's education, wealth, and class credentials have separated him from the majority of black and brown people, and as such, he fails to pass Professor Andrews' racial authenticity test. Clearly, the Prime Minister is nothing more than a patsy who represents the continuity of a destructive system, rather than a break with the past. Sunak, all optics and symbolism like Obama, floated into office on a hot air balloon of hyperbole about the merits of Britain's successful multiracial democracy. Then, the puffery petered out, as soon as the first Prime Minister of Asian heritage confirmed Sala Braverman as his Home Secretary. With this decision, Sunak revealed the limits of UK Hindu power and the weakness of his own position. Sunak could not hope to transform British politics whilst his party trailed by 20 points in the polls. He was immediately on the political back foot and forced to tack to the right, to keep the Tory newspapers on side and Nigel Farage at bay. And if this meant an unprecedented and a liberal hawkish line on immigration that would play to the right-wing Tory base, then so be it. And so, over the past 18 months, Sunak has pledged to tackle the small boats migrants crisis. He has doubled down on his party's Rwanda policy and allowed speculation to continue that he might plunge Britain into a fight with European justices in order to get his signature policy into law. Sala Braverman, the hammer of the migrants, was the imperfect saleswoman for this strategy. When Braverman's refried Powellism made her surplus to requirements, Tory MP Lee Anderson was thrust center stage. Incendiary comments on a fringe satellite TV channel didn't stop the MP from becoming deputy chair of the Conservative Party, reassuring supporters that the red meat of Tory racism would continue to be part of the Conservative brand. Lee Anderson soon caused offence again, but it was not until his appalling comment that London Mayor Sadiq Khan, who is Muslim, had ceded control of the capital to Islamists, that Anderson had the party whip withdrawn. The sitting MP for Ashfield is now free to join Farage's Reform Party, leaving the Prime Minister no nearer to refuting the cynicism of Professor Andrews, and the accusation he made in his CNN article, that Sunak's premiership is not a win for the country's black and brown people.
It's a terrible irony that the more diverse the cabinet gets, the more danger black and brown citizens find themselves in. I am truly terrified at the prospect of a Sunak premiership because anything becomes possible once this Conservative Party's Prime Minister is brown. It tells you the nature of the threat when I am genuinely hoping that he feels the need to surround himself with mediocre white men to prove his credentials. So please do not celebrate. This is certainly a case when diversity is the opposite of racial progress.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will almost certainly fight this year's election on the promise that Europe and the Labour Party stand in his way of stopping illegal immigration. Sunak will need to energize his base after 5 prime ministers and 14 years of Tory rule, and will need the likes of Braverman and Anderson, selling the Conservative gospel from door to door. The PM's failure to condemn Anderson in forthright terms authenticates Professor Andrews' view of race politics in the country. During his years in office, Benjamin Disraelli, Britain's first Jewish Prime Minister, faced virulent anti-Semitism from within and without his Conservative Party. Nevertheless, Disraeli was not required to pursue a raft of anti-Jewish immigration policies to prove himself a patriot to the British elites he served. Indeed, Disraeli was long out of office before the 1905 Aliens Act became law. The act introduced immigration controls and registration for the first time, and targeted as undesirable those who appeared unable to support themselves or whom were likely to become a charge upon the rates. The legislation reflected the anti-Semitism of the period and was designed to control Jewish migration, particularly from Eastern Europe, which had increased in the latter decades of the 19th century. Sunak, however, is required to prove his loyalty, over and over again, to the system. The Prime Minister, Braverman, and Foreign Secretary James Cleverly are constantly surveilled and assessed by political friends and foes on their positions regarding asylum, the code word for race, and traduced if they appear to be going soft. Rishi Sunak can be weak on tax cuts, and a little wet on his Europe policy, but anything less than the firmest anti-migrant signals would amount to political treason. That is why Braverman, the daughter of Asian migrants, is considered a darling of the Tory constituencies for her view that Britain faces a hurricane of migrants, poised to invade the country. It is Braverman who believes that multiculturalism has failed, in spite of the unprecedented number of non-white MPs in Britain's parliament and the myriad contribution of black and brown personalities to British public life. Sounding more like a conservative politician at the 1964 Smethwick by-election, it was Braverman who declared just last year that uncontrolled and illegal migration is an existential challenge for the political and cultural institutions of the West. It is Braverman who dreams of, who is obsessed by planeloads of illegal immigrants flying off to Rwanda. And it is Braverman who relishes every public opportunity to lean into great replacement conspiracy theorizing. What is clear is that black and brown politicians, on both sides of the Atlantic, who assume positions of great power, can only prosper if their policies continue normative and long-established racial understandings, and do not threaten the status quo. That is why Obama cannot be accused of wanting to defund the police, nor did he break new ground in the nation's approach to racial justice, the racial wealth gap, or the war on drugs. Sunak would be flung out of office faster than a decaying lettuce, were he to admit publicly that the country's migrant crisis was fueled, in part, by business demands for cheap labor in crucial sectors such as agriculture, construction, hospitality, health, transport, and distribution. This is why Sunak has no other choice but to hold his nose and talk about migrants in a way that disavows his own Ugandan family's understanding of the importance of asylum. Is this the price Sunak is ready to pay for power? Like the former American president, is Sunak boxed in by the exigencies of party politics and the iron demand of modern race capitalism for peace over progress? Has Sunak lived down to expectations, just as Professor Kane Andrews predicted? These are questions for another podcast. Please like and share this episode. And whilst you are here, please subscribe to the channel to receive all of our videos and podcasts as soon as they are released. Thanks for listening.